All right, guys, this is Dr. Bryan Mann, University of Miami, talking about velocity-based training with you today for GymAware. All right, let's see. So, my start with velocity-based training, and why is it called VBT anyways? And also, it's kind of saying, watch out what you say when you're three sheets to the wind. But my strength and conditioning career started in 1999 with a guy named Rick Perry, who several people know. And I worked with him from 1999 to 2004. And during that tenure, Rick had a bunch of old Soviet texts. Some well translated, some not. And some were photocopies of photocopies and whatnot. But I worked with him from 99 to 2004. And somewhere around between 2000 and 2003, Louis Simmons had gotten a Tendo, and he'd started writing about it, and we went to visit him at one point in time, and it was right whenever Louis first got the Tendo. And it was reporting things in feet per second, meters per second, and watts, and some other unit of power, and I can't remember what that was. Long story short, whenever I saw that, I remembered that, hey, in all of these Soviet texts, there was this M/S or this MS to the superscript -1. And here I'm seeing this. I've got some ideas of what we could do with this. And I, believe in greatly in what Sir Isaac Newton once said. If I've seen further than other men, it's only because I've stood upon the shoulders of giants. So I looked at the work from Roman, Verkhoshansky, Matveyev, the guys that wrote Ayan and Baroga, and I just adapted it for us in sport with the athletes that we were working with rather than Olympic lifters. Then around 2004, 2005, whenever I was working with Pat Ivey at the University of Missouri, we were using the Tendo and then eventually the GymAware. And then we used that because, hey, we found that we needed to. We needed to have velocity as a threshold, or else our power number suffered. And then other devices also popped in, but all that VBT is, and why is it called VBT, velocity-based training? Well, I started out calling it the Tendo, and if you look back at, if you are one of the unfortunate few that bought the first text, I think it was like 30 pages or something like that, and I called it the use of the Tendo to develop explosive athletes, or something along those lines, right? You would think I'd know what I wrote, but I don't remember what I ate for breakfast. And whenever we were at the CSCCA out in Salt Lake City, which is where it used to be held every year, we were at Port of Call, and I am three sheets to the wind, and somebody comes up to me and says, hey, what are you going to call it now? Now there's MyoTest, and there's GymAware, and there's another device I can't remember at that time. So it's not just Tendo anymore. Like, velocity-based training. And I don't remember saying that. But the next morning, okay, let's be honest, the next day around lunch, I'm making my way down. I'm like, hey, I like that. You call it VBT. That's cool, velocity-based training. And it stuck. Now, while I didn't give my personal standpoint, my personal timeline about, all this stuff, I didn't become Dr. Mann until 2011. And I believe the first text came out in something like 2008. And it was just basically as a result of people emailing me questions, and I got tired of answering the same thing over and over again. So I wrote a little manual. Now, I didn't become Dr. Mann until 2011. So this was done entirely from the practitioner's standpoint. I think that sometimes there's a disconnect between researchers and practitioners, because researchers want precision at all costs. They want to be able to explain things and control and all of that. And practitioners want to be able to implementability. They want sustainability. And there's sometimes a dichotomy there. The two wolves fighting each other, specifically in me, in my own head. Hey, this is great for research, but, we can't do it. In my opinion, for the strength and conditioning coach for training, everything needs to be super simple and easy to implement on the floor. If I have to have 60 different things going on with 60 different athletes at one time, because I've got 60 athletes on the floor, it's not going to work. It's not going to be able to maintain. So I wanted to make sure that we had something that we could implement. department-wide. Now, the researchers are going to want the precision. And how I'm sort of looking at this right now in my own head, I should say, and I don't know if this is a good thing, is that whenever we're testing and doing like force velocity profiling and things like that, that's whenever we're going to go for the precision. But for the training, I want the ease of implementation. As long as they're getting positive adaptations, who cares if it was as precise or not? But that's just me, and that's my opinion. So here's Rick and I. I might be standing on a chair. I'm not sure. No, it wasn't in that photo. Him getting his master's jacket when I was at Southwest Missouri State. For those of you who don't know, there's Louis Simmons. And while he looks like he would have a very deep, bass-like voice, my name's Louis Simmons, and I found the Tendo unit brought over to the United States. That's just my little Louis impressions for some people if you need the humor. Louis, love him, hate him. Some people have a disdain for him. He's an innovator. And he will challenge you and make you think. And that's one of the things that I've loved about Louis throughout my career. There's Dr. Pat Ivey. And then, hey, it's not just the Tendo, like I'd mentioned. What do we call it? Well, look at all these different things that we've got. And some of them are defunct now. The myotest is no longer there. There used to be an angel band, a beast sensor. And, there's some things that come and go. So the reason why we call it VBT is because you can implement all of it. Now, I will say this, that the linear position transducers, if you've got those, they're all pretty spot on. It doesn't matter who the maker of the device is. It's pretty close. But then whenever you've got some different systems, they'll measure differently, and we'll get to that in a minute. So VBT is just using devices that measure displacement in time. They're going to calculate velocity and they're going to calculate power. And they're nothing but a stopwatch, a tape measure, and a calculator. That's it, man. It's not magic. The LPT, again, is basically a stopwatch and a measuring tape. And that's, I'm oversimplifying things. But whenever you get down to it, there's a potentiometer down in there that will measure the angle and how much of the spool, how many times the spool goes around, how much of it came out. So it gets the distance and time from there, divides that out, boom. Things like the GymAware and some others have x-axis corrections that will help to make that be good, but we'll get to that in a minute. The accelerometers use accelerometer, magnet gyro, and a magnetometer combination. They've got to use algorithms to detect start, stop, bar path, etc. So sometimes you're going to get measurement issues. I know that whenever I'm not going to name the device, but I was sent a device and I played around with it and just changed up my technique on some cleans. It was still clean. It was still, fairly decent. But the measurement, sometimes it would not read it at all, just with a slight change in the technique. Again, they've changed the algorithms and they've gotten better, so I'm not going to sell anybody out there. Then let's talk about the some other systems, right? Some other ways that people are doing velocity now with the camera-based systems. So you've got a reference distance, and it can either be given by, hey, you stand inside this box that we see on the screen and you do this movement, like with some of the 2D motion analysis for measuring jump height. Or it'll have a reference like, hey, this plate is 17.5 inches, so I know that I can scale everything down to that. And then they use the frame rate for the time stamp, because if it's 60 frames per second, well, you know how much time has passed for each frame. Then there's also laser, which is pretty cool, man, and that's what the Flex uses. And it needs a reflective surface, but it's using the laser for the position data instead of a spool, so it's still just going straight vertical. Pretty interesting. Some of the units will also give you bar path, and I think that the bar path is great. There's been some research dealing with weightlifters looking about the horizontal displacement throughout the lift, and they would find that the more horizontal displacement there was, the more that linked into overtraining. So that's something that's pretty cool that you can do and get more from the data that you already collect if you are using a device that does that. Now, I do have a warning for the linear position transducer. Now, if you don't have the x-axis correction, you've got to make sure that sucker is straight up and down. My YouTube channel, my first video that was ever on there. Now it's not the only video that's on my YouTube channel. I've started, if somebody has questions in my classes, I'll often record a video, and if I think it's good for the strength coaches, I'll throw it up onto my YouTube channel. But you've got to measure. Like, look, this line right here. This is what a linear position transducer is trying to measure. Now, what I often see is whenever people are doing hang cleans or something of that ilk, that they will put the, here will be the unit, and they'll step back 2-3 feet so they don't drop the bar on there. Well, they're measuring the hypotenuse. They're not measuring the y-axis. So the x-axis correction just simply throws in, sine is opposite over hypotenuse. So the sine of this angle, knowing what the hypotenuse is, so we've got the sine, we've got this distance, we can calculate that. So that's the x-axis correction. So make sure that if you're using an LPT, you want x-axis correction on there. If you don't have x-axis correction, you've got to be very, very critical for every set and repetition about the placement of the unit. Now, really quickly, before we go on, I want something that'll basically give you a better BS detector. And I said 4 main ways the cell produces force. Well, that's not really completely true, but it's good enough for government work, right? So we've got a myofibril adaptation, so we're increasing the heavy chain myosin in the diameter of it, in the strength of the titin, in the which will, it's got some elastic capabilities, and it connects the actins within the myosin neck, which will increase the stretch shortening cycle force and things like that by giving some a little bit more elastic recoil. And we typically train those with 70 to 85% to 1 RM, right? Then the size principle, all right? Hindeman's size principle. This is the trying to recruit the high threshold motor units, and this is best done at 90% and above. Now, rate coding. This is the major one that VBT hits. It's just how fast can we send that signal down the nervous system, right? And then there's the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and this has got to do with the release and reabsorption of calcium. Now, why is this important? Well, you've got to go all the way back to that hard physiology, right? So the calcium comes out, it's released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, goes on to the, so then it goes back in through the muscle cell, right? And then it'll be reabsorbed by the T tubules. It hits the troponin C, which moves the tropomyosin, which makes an active binding site for the myosin to grab a hold of. So the faster that you can release and reabsorb calcium, the better off you are. Now let me kick back here. So we talked about 70 to 85% for the myofibril adaptations. Size principle is best done at 90% of 1 RM and higher to recruit the high threshold motor units. Rate coding. I mean, dude, this is Olympic weightlifting. This is jumping, not true plyometrics, but the jumping. And then the sarcoplasmic reticulum, man, the only way to do that and improve the function of that is sprinting. So what does that sound like? If you lift light and a lot of tension, if you lift super heavy, if you lift fast and you sprint, it sounds like good balance training to me. Then, of course, you've got the parallel elastic component, right, with the fascia and the collagen matrix. So we've got like the, what is that? The dystrophin and laminin, which come off and they go into the endomysium, and we can save that for a whole nother thing. If you're interested in that, I think I talked about it on one of my YouTube channel, and I've also got a coach's education course through the University of Miami that's got that coming out soon if it hasn't already. Now, I usually end with this, but I want to go ahead and just hit this at the start. VBT, it's a nice to have. It's great. But before we even go there, for some of you younger folks, this here on the left, it's called MAP. Right? And back whenever I was younger, I drove from right here, Springfield, Missouri, Ingram Mill Road and Sunshine, to 18th and Indian School Road here in Phoenix, Arizona, using a McNally's Atlas, which is just a system of maps. And maps have been used for millennia. They've got maps, drawn on freaking, skins and stuff, so that people would know where to go and what was around, and for people, their colleagues and the people that followed them. Now, if you know where you are, what's around you, and where you want to go, a map is a highly accurate way to travel. I only got lost once, and it was right about here near Gallup, New Mexico. And it was just because I thought I was one more exit up. And I was trying to turn around and go back to a hotel. I decided I was not going to be able to make it to Winslow, Arizona. Now, the GPS, however, the GPS utilizes technology. If it's actually GPS, it's using 3 satellite triangulation, up above you, right? And that can tell you where you are within, I think it's 3 feet. I only know that I don't know that because of like my own personal stuff. My wife's stepfather is a aerospace engineer who, I don't know if he created GPS, but he's definitely somebody who was higher up in its development. It tells you exactly where you are, how fast you're going, what the speed limit is, if there's a cop ahead, for Christ's sake, how soon until your next turn, if you passed something. It tells you a lot of information. The percentage-based training is the map. We can absolutely do tremendous things with that. But the GPS is super handy, super nice. And that's what VBT is. It tells you where that athlete is at any given moment. So you don't have to guess about how to change the loads. It tells you what to do with a little help from your friends. Now, large team integration at science, and this is where I live, because being a coach for so long and having large teams, I mean, shoot, I would love having groups like this, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8 people on the floor at one time. Amazing. But that's not what we typically did. It was typically much, much larger, 40, 50, 60 people at once. I think the smallest team I ever had on the floor at one time was 20, I'd say for women's basketball, where there was 14 girls. But still, it's a pretty large deal. You've got to have that simple implementation. If you are going to go nuts trying to figure out what's going on, it's not going to work. It was impossible for me. I'm going to give this addendum for me to monitor 40 to 60 people simultaneously every day. I could handle 5, maybe 10, but that was the limit. That feedback, it aids in the coaching, man. So the athletes all understand high score, so you're going to use that to your advantage. And through that, it encourages the competitiveness. So one thing to keep in mind, 2 things, right, is that the velocities listed were collected based off of the average of several teams that were Division I, and they were all speed power. Okay, it was the baseball, football, women's softball, and one other team at 2 different Division I universities in the Midwest. Every individual, though, is an N of 1. Now, some of the athletes that I've dealt with down here at the University of Miami, they don't quite match it. And let me also say this before I move on. Whenever I had a freak, I adjusted. So I would make things faster for somebody who was a freak. I didn't always adjust for those who were not freaks, because that, it seemed a bit redundant to me. It was too time consuming, and I needed to get them faster, more powerful anyway, so why slow it down? I had a homogeneous data collection, man. And honestly, there was a study from Harry Dorrell that came out that showed that individual versus group means there was no statistical difference in their gains. There was a trend, of course, that the individual did better than the group. But if you give somebody an individual prescription, they do better. Just look at the work by, I believe it was Jimenez Reyes and Samazino, or J.B. Marin, where they looked at individual versus global training programs. And they individualized, there was no non-responders. The zones, for me, they're a starting point. And if they need to be adjusted, they need to be adjusted. And again, they're therefore linear position transducers. Or if something measures right in line with the LPT, you can use that too. And I also want to say that results rather than dogma should be the driving factor. Look for the results. If you need to change it for yourself, change it, dude. It was not written in stone. This was not handed down by God speaking through a burning bush to Moses to be written down on stone tablets. It's not. Make it work for you. So the VBT zones in a team setting, I'll just quickly show you this next slide that was power development for 4 years. Now, the power development, it was measured through the Sears equation on vertical jump. We didn't have force plates at the time, so we just looked to say, hey, here's my body weight, here's my jump height, what's entered in the equation, boom, I got peak anaerobic power in watts. So the levels is when we use VBT, and then the traditional is percentage-based training. Why haven't I changed it? Guys, I'm not that tech savvy, apparently. And I probably should learn how to do this. The y-axis is the percentage change as found by the counter movement jump, and x-axis is the years in the program. And long story short, we see here, hey, whoa, we did a lot better than the traditional. Oh, that's fantastic, right? Some people always say, hey, that's got to be poor training. You juiced that. Well, no, it isn't. Traditional training is consistent with the work put out on Texas A&M, Oklahoma State, University of Dayton. They've all put papers out about how speed and power, vertical jump, didn't change after the first 18 months of training. And I also used power for both of those populations, for the traditional and the VBT, to account for changes in body weight. Now, we used the zones, and that was it. We used the zones on squats. That's it, man. And then we used minimum threshold velocity for our cleans. And we saw huge improvements in power. That was really the only difference, the only major difference that occurred. The sets and reps and the basic planned for the intensities were the same. What changed? VBT, baby. That's it. The VBT zones led to power increases for a greater number of years, and then thus the zones are effective in large team settings. Okay. Quantify traits, and these are done for the squat and deadlift. The bench press is different, but in my opinion, it doesn't matter, man. It doesn't matter for sports, so where are we going to really care too much about it? We're always going to program it, though, because the athletes love to bench, or at least the athletes that I've dealt with. So if you don't train it, you don't program it, they're going to go do it somewhere else. So at least we can control it here. But basically, about 80% of 1RM came out to about 0.5 meters per second for us, for squats, etc. So 0.5 on down is absolute strength. Okay, well, 80% and down. There you go. 60 to 80% correlated to about 0.5 to 0.75 meters per second. And then we had strength, speed, and speed strength. Now, these really back up to peak power, right? So we're looking at about that 30 to 60-ish percent range, maybe 70%. And at peak, power typically happen at about 1 meter per second for our football athletes. And strength, speed, and speed strength, they're best defined by, what they're trying to enhance. Are they trying to enhance force and velocity equally, which is strength speed, or are they trying to put speed way out in front of strength, which is the speed strength? And we'll see that through some Masahiro Kaneko work if you're really interested in that type of explanation. Starting strength, which really, I'm debating about changing this because everybody thinks about starting strength as like deadlift, starting from a dead stop, and that's not it. I mean, that's pure concentric absolute strength. The starting strength may be better defined as starting speed because it is the ability to rapidly overcome inertia. All right. So let's go back to some more of the stuff with the naming. With the accelerative strength, everybody thinks about accelerating down a track, and that's not it. It's accelerating through a load. Right. The big rock exercises, from the stuff that I've collected on Division I to Division II athletes, the slopes were not significantly different. Right. So the cutoffs were. Like the 1RM on a bench press is 0.15 for most college athletes, and for squat it was somewhere between 0.26 and 0.35. That one actually happened to depend on the year. The more advanced in training, your seniors, they were down around 0.26. Your younger athletes were up around 0.35. So all this correlation that we just talked about comes out to this nice figure that most people have already seen, that Heather had with GymAware had put together, and it's a gorgeous little figure there. So again, we just look at the overlap, man. So whenever we're looking at strength and conditioning, we often see that there are different people saying different things. And I remember going out and sitting down with Buddy Morris with Rick at one point in time. But whenever we went and visited Louis in Columbus, Ohio, Buddy Morris happened to be up with the Cleveland Browns at that time. Tom Zielinski was the assistant. Rob Phillips was also an assistant. And I sat down and I asked Buddy, I'm like, hey, everybody is saying something different, man. How do I know what's true, what's right? He said the truth typically lies in the overlap. And whenever you see the overlap, that's something to look at. You know you're onto something. Now, strength, speed, and speed strength, we need to talk about the differentiation there. They're two different traits. They're not interchangeable, man. That's been found by Jadovsev, Jindaka, Roman, Verkhoshansky. Whenever you get down to it, Masahiro Kaneko. Strength speed is the heavier weights and the slower acceleration. And honestly, saying heavier, that's just relative, right? So strength speed is basically where you have equal adaptations from the force end of the spectrum and the velocity end of the spectrum. Typically around 60% of 1 RM, and it causes power to go up and expressed power. But what I mean by expressed power is that it wasn't taking so long to hit your movements that the power can still be expressed within sport. You've only got about 200 milliseconds to do that. Again, that's why VBT is important. So strength speed is that 0.75 to 1.0. Speed strength is the 1.0 to 1.3. Lightweight, fast acceleration, great improvement in velocity, smaller improvement, small to moderate improvement in force, and that leads to pretty good improvement in power. Now we see that double asterisk that's listed there on the speed strength. Well, that's for squats, deadlifts, that type of thing. The Olympic lifts, they were typically higher velocities, and their speed strength by nature. Can you do a clean slow? Yes, but it is ugly. Doesn't really look like a clean. But you move the bar from your knees to your shoulders, so you'll call it that. Don't take a picture or tweet this out yet. We're actually working on this, getting this published as of right now. What this is the bench and front squat, or trap bar deadlift and bench press. I can't remember actually right now. If you notice those slopes are dang near parallel, are they off a little bit? Is there a little bit wider gap at the right than there is the left? Yeah, but it's not bad. There is, within research and clinical research specifically, they have got statistical significance, estimate of effect size, in this thing that they call MCID, which was the minimal clinically important difference. Okay, and that means that, hey, these two things might be statistically significant, but it doesn't mean anything clinically. If I put on 5 kilos of strength onto my legs, that might be a significant improvement in strength, but it actually doesn't cause a clinically improvement in my sit-stand or something like that. So you've got to take that into account. How VBT helps, man. Let's get down to it. It allowed us to quantify and differentiate the traits, and really, even beyond that, just give the athlete a metric, something to reach for whenever they're just told all the time, at least in the United States, heavier is better, heavier is better, heavier is better. Well, now we can give them the faster is better, and we can actually tell them, move it faster, you're not moving it fast enough. And that allowed us to help to quantify and differentiate those traits. The speed strength in the Olympic lifts with the regression analysis, I've told this story a million times that I'm a horrible procrastinator. And I had just taken my first full-time job with the University of Missouri. Now, with that first full-time job at the University of Missouri, I was also starting my doctoral program. So I thought, hey, I'm a procrastinator. This is the perfect time to change, right? Massive life changes. Might as well pick up a new habit. So I was traveling a lot with the women's basketball team, and I knew that, hey, during this period, whenever this paper's due, I have got a lot of travel going on, so I better change things up. And so here's what I did. I wrote the paper, and I knew that Olympic lifts, we do it to improve explosive strength, so improvements in Olympic lifts should be related to improvements in the vertical jump. Wrote everything out, left spaces for the statistics to be thrown in, and bada boom, bada bing, here you go. Here we are today, the day that we learn how to run this specific statistic that I knew that I would need to learn how to do. I take it over to the stats lab, put my zip disk in, my flash drive in, and find no significant difference. So I call up somebody far smarter than me. they found the same thing. So obviously she wasn't smarter than I was. Actually, she was. That's facetious. And then I end up thinking that she doesn't know what she's talking about either. And I've had concussions. There's no way that could be true, that there was no relationship between cleans and vertical jump. And I take it to the professor who has, degrees from like Stanford, Princeton, and Yale, all in statistics. The guy is amazingly brilliant. And it turns out that I did everything correctly and that there was no relationship. So then I've got to take this to my boss. And I knew it wasn't going to go well. I was like, hey, coach, how do we test explosive strength? Vertical jump. Okay, how do we train it? The cleans. And he's getting angry. I'm like, so if we see an improvement in cleans, we should see an improvement in vertical jump. Yeah, we should. Yeah, we will. That's what happens. That's why we do it. I'm like, okay, but what would happen if we didn't? It's like, well, I'd say you ran that you did something wrong. You must have looked at it wrong. I'm like, well, I ran the stats, and here it is. You ran the stats wrong. Dr. Osterlin ran the stats. Oh, crap. So we had to step back and look at things. And whenever we get down to it, our cleans weren't really looking like good cleans. We had gotten focused in on the mass moved, on how much weight was moved, rather than the quality of movement. And then that really, that shut us down. That cost us quite a bit. Now, that being said, whenever we started throwing in a qualifier, you had to hit a minimum threshold velocity on the clean, and then you would be able to go ahead and knock that out. That's what it required. If you didn't hit that minimum threshold velocity, it was the same as if you didn't stand up with the movement. So that really helped us out, and then we started seeing improvements in relationship between power and vertical jump. Now, it was the third improvement of body composition and improvement in strength to mass ratio of the squat were still 1 and 2, but it did become a positive relationship. I also should go back and say that our team was a little bit weaker at that time, and that the strength to mass ratio, they were below double body weight squat. So I think the clean probably would come up a little bit more if they were already strong. Now, what VBT does, give feedback in the forms of velocity, power, percentage of best repetition, which can be used for different things. It gives it an average and peak for most units, and sometimes now even mean propulsive. It accounts for the stress and current training status, as we'll see here shortly. Outside stressors definitely affect training. Allows for auto-regulation, or sometimes call it flexible nonlinear periodization. Some people call it agile periodization. Some people just feel like they've got to put a name out there just to make themselves feel better. I don't know. Whenever you get down to it, it's really all under one umbrella of either auto-regulation. That's the way that I see it, at least, because you're regulating oneself. Allows one to train at the weight they need for that day and that set. It is what it is, man. They some days are good, some days are bad. Velocity versus power, man. So here's the deal. Okay, power is a fluff metric, and let's not even worry about this. What do I mean by fluff metric? Actually, I'm not the one who called it fluff metric. It was Dr. Jason Lake, University of Chichester, and he was referring to it on the force plates. But power is force times velocity. Well, if velocity is part of that power equation, let's even look at it a different way. Okay, power is force times velocity. So let's say my power is 500, and let's say that's a great power number. I can hit that 500 from having my force be 10 and my velocity be 50, or my force being 50 and my velocity being 10. Hopefully I said that right. Both of them come out to 500, and they've got totally different ways that you achieve that. I like the velocity. I'm going to use the velocity because of the established standards, all right, and the established relationship, so then I don't have to worry about anything else like that. Why you need VBT? Well, getting stronger is only part of the equation. We'll show with a couple of charts here momentarily that expressing force quickly may be more important than strength down the line for performance because of the enhancement of rate coding rather than just worrying about the myofibril. Of course, we're also going to have the SAID principle, or the specific adaptations of imposed demands, which leads into the transfer of trainedness. How am I results in one leading to results in the other? Tudor Bompa, way back in the day, in his original Theories and Methodologies of Strength Training, or Theories and Methodologies of Periodization, I don't remember, it's got a reddish-orange cover, said that all strengths relate back to absolute strength. Therefore, that blah 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 yada yada yada. The stronger you get, the more explosive you'll get, etc. But whenever we get down to it, man, said principle still is a thing. So if you want to be fast, train fast. Compensatory acceleration training actually has the highest force output of any style of training per whenever we control for load. So something to think about. Now here is a adaptation from Kramer and Hakkinen and Gatorade Sports Science Institute number 53. It's also in the NSCA Essentials text now. Long story short, let's look at the solid line is the untrained, the dashed line is heavy resistance strength train, and the dotted line is explosive ballistic strength train. We see force on the vertical axis, time on the horizontal axis. And if we want to see who's the strongest, obviously, what's going to lead to the most strength gains? Heavy resistance strength training. Squat heavy, squat often, you're going to get strong. A distant second to that is the explosive ballistic strength train. And of course, if you never lift weights, you're not going to get any stronger. So you're going to be the weakest. But what if we look back at the 200 milliseconds? Now, why 200 milliseconds? Well, most sport is dealing with rate-limited activities, where we don't have that long to express force. So we need to do it quickly. If we look there, explosive ballistic strength training becomes the king, followed by heavy resistance strength training, and then the untrained individuals. So we can see how that all comes into impact. It's like, hey, it's not just lift heavy, it's lift fast. There's additional work from Hakkinen that shows that you have an increase in neural drive by that light explosive training, especially with the early onset, which affects the rate of force development, which is why this looks like it does. Whenever we're looking at things, I had a big influence from Alvermeal, and he had a performance pyramid, and I really loved that. And I think that it's so true still for everything today. At the base of the pyramid, the way that I see it for training, is work capacity and mobility. If somebody cannot achieve the position or does not have the conditioning to be able to make it through a training session, then you're wasting your time with anything else. You're not going to see a good adaptation. Beyond that, after you achieve the requisite mobility to get into the appropriate positions and the requisite conditioning to be able to handle training, then you go up to base strength, which is going to increase. That's that 70 to 85%, where you're increasing the myofibril, et cetera, et cetera. The absolute strength is once you get good at the base strength, you throw in some Hinneman size principle. After that is whenever we look at the specific strengths and traits with VBT. Okay, so it isn't for everyone. Also, not being for everybody, this is an example of a workout that I wrote for some shot putters back in 2011. We're at week 8, so we're transitioned into the power phase. We just started. I think this might be the last week for the squats and bench press where we were still doing them heavy. But if you look, we see all of these different exercises that are listed. And how many have velocity? 1, 2, 3. Okay. How many potentially could have velocity? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Right, 9. Now, out of those, not all of them would I, put on because I don't think it's germane for this. But we can see these two that I typically, with my Olympic weightlifting movements and derivatives, I usually put velocity on there. Why didn't I here? Well, the split jerk and the hang snatch were newer movements for them. And honestly, their technique was just crap. It wasn't crap, but it wasn't where I wanted it to be. So instead of giving them one more thing to focus on, I just told them to worry about their technique. Let's clean up the technique and we'll get to the velocity later. Now, I show this because some people call me the godfather of VBT, king of VBT, whatever. Dude, I don't put VBT on everything, so I don't understand what's going on with people who are doing face pulls and bicep curls for speed. It makes no sense to me. Maybe I'm overlooking something, but to me it just seemed like you're majoring in minor. My dad used to say go pole vaulting over mouse turds. So it just doesn't make sense, at least not to me. Just because you can do something doesn't necessarily mean that you need to, especially whenever we start looking at, and this is the one that grinds my gears, whenever people are starting to look at velocity on a overhead squat, which is done for mobility and stability, or a Turkish get-up, which is done for mobility and stability. Why in God's name would you want to try and move faster with that? Focus on you do the movement for its intended purpose. if you want to change things up and you've got a different goal in training, change the exercises. It's okay. Realize that VBT isn't an end all, man. Again, I had it on 3. 2 of them I focus more on speed. I'd eventually have 5, right? That's it. How VBT works, it's just measuring the speed or the velocity of the bar. Jennings et al. Found that to be accurate. It gives you immediate feedback. Different lifts have different speeds, different strengths have different speeds, and the athletes move their proper weight for that exact set, which we'll get you to shortly with this immediate feedback. Man, it's instantaneous and objective. It just, as soon as you get that repetition, it tells you what its speed was. It tells you how that did for your set for that time. All right? It doesn't matter who that person is. I remember at one point in time we had a Heisman candidate and a walk-on lifting on the same platform. The speed was the speed. It did not care. It encourages that competitive nature on the floor and acts as another coach. Now let's talk about that for a second. With that the competitive nature, that will show up again with a paper from Randall et al. We'll go over here momentarily. That basically, they're athletes. They're competitive. They're competitive by nature. So if somebody beats their score with a certain load, of course they're going to want to come back and beat it. So then that's leading to a higher quality of work, and that enhances the rate coding to a greater extent. It serves as another coach on the floor, but that, the more that I've said that and the more that I've gone into it, I'm kind of just wondering if I'm saying this correctly. It helps you to dictate the load. It does not control for technique. So I see so many people who I've mentioned, that have seen my talks and they've heard me mention this. They no longer look at the way that the athlete moves during the lift. They're only looking at the device to see what the speed was. You've got to coach technique. You're called coach. The device is not. Coach a technique. Use that as feedback. Okay? So here's that Randall paper that I wanted to talk to you guys about. Now, this was the effect of instantaneous performance feedback during 6 weeks of VBT on sport-specific performance tests. Their training program was exactly the same. Same percentage of 1RM, same set, same reps, same rest intervals. All of that was the same. One thing differed. On their jump squats, one group received the feedback of their velocity, the other group did not. So let's see and these are pro rugby athletes. Also, Nick Gill was on the paper, the strength coach for the New Zealand All Blacks. So hopefully you wouldn't think that he would do something that would juice this inappropriately. I think that's ludicrous. Some people don't like the study, but hey, you know what? It's okay. I love it. If we look here, and they use some magnitude-based inference and realize that this paper came out before that the MBI was railed by the professor out of Stanford. So they were going with what they thought was best. So vertical jump, we see that they went up 3 centimeters. Who received feedback? The group that did not was 1 centimeter. The horizontal jump, 6 versus 1. So that's some pretty massive improvements. And also in 6 weeks, man, if I'm moving up an inch on my vertical jump in 6 weeks with trained athletes, that's huge, man. That's huge. Versus a centimeter, so that's a little less than half an inch. Come on, man. That's big time. The horizontal jump, again, 6 centimeters, looking at 2 to 3 inches. And then the non-feedback group had 1 centimeter. Then we look at the sprints. So here's something that's key, and I want to point this out, that for our 10 time, we don't see much of a difference. We see a 0.01 for the 10, and we see a virtual no change here for the non-feedback group. This is to be expected. Why? Because we're working on velocity into the spectrum rather than the force. 10 times are related to relative strength to mass ratio. So not seeing a massive improvement here makes sense. Seeing a 0.03 improvement versus a 0.00 improvement here at the 20 meter, this is making sense because we're getting more up to where the velocity of movement would have a transfer. And then at the 30 meter sprint, where we see the 0.06 improvement, the 1.4% change, this makes perfect sense because you're up and moving. This is a speed activity, so we would expect to see the greatest improvements here. So long story short, they didn't change a thing about the program between the two. Didn't change reps, didn't change sets. Everybody did the exact same thing. It was a higher quality of work and better adaptations as a result of simply having the feedback of velocity. What this says is it doesn't matter what you do, it matters how you do it. Okay? So you can just simply go out, throw the devices on the floor, and you're probably going to start seeing better results just because they start having a little bit of fun with it. I remember a interview that Augie did from whenever he was at University of Delaware, that whenever they got the VBT devices and they threw them out on the floor, squatting became fun because it became competitive, and they hated squatting before. So there you go. This study from Pareja Blanco, basically what this is showing is that we had significantly better results in the counter movement jump height because they were going with max intended velocity versus a half intended velocity. So speed of movement matters. Said principles in full effect. We see here that the 10 and the 20 and the counter movement jump was likely better due to the use of velocity. The 10 and the 20 was unclear. This is surprising to me to see that the 20 was worse than the 10, but I believe, if I remember correctly, these were younger athletes, so that their strength levels were poor all the way around. The 1RM got better from doing fewer repetitions, or doing the same number of repetitions, just at a higher speed. And then the velocities, of course, they're going to be faster if you're giving feedback, right? Now, why is it so effective? One of the things that I think is we often get so caught up in physiology, we forget about psychology. And one of the key tenets to this, I think, is self-determination theory. And it's one that I love. And it could just simply be because of my academic upbringing with Rick McGuire, who started the sports psychology for USA Track and Field, one of the godfathers of sports psychology. Self-determination theory from DC and Ryan. It was a three-pronged approach about how you can go from extrinsic to intrinsic motivation. So they're taking external cues leading to intrinsic motivation. People are wanting to do something because they want to. Again, remember how I just said squatting became fun because it became competitive? They're going faster because they wanted to, not because you told them to, because they want to. Now, self-determination theory, this could be a 2-hour talk in and of itself, and there are far better people to give it than I, quite frankly. But let's just talk about it really quickly with a three-pronged approach. Really, there's three things to it. There's competence, autonomy, and relatedness. Competence, they're good at it, and they know it. People don't want to expose themselves in an area where they are not good. My vocal cords are a little bit jacked up today. Let me drink some water here. But I dabble around with a couple of instruments. You're never going to catch me playing them in public, man. I suck. Horrifically. Guitar and harmonica, the harmonica a little bit better than I am at the guitar. And also my hands have been broken so many times they don't move right. But so you'll never catch me doing that in public. But it's nothing for me to go, "Oh, Daddy boy, the pipes are calling." I was in choir for a long time. I can carry a tune. I'll sing in public. You'll never see me play because I'm not competent. Likewise, the athletes, whenever you are forcing them to do something that they're not competent in, you're really trying to push and drive that. So it's not about the teaching part. Don't get me wrong. You've got to have your teaching part. But if it's the thing that you're trying to drive them, that you're putting all your money in, they're not going to go hard on something that they're not competent on because they're scared. They don't want to do it wrong. They don't want to be called out. Autonomy. They're directly in charge of something. We're programming. One of the things that I used to love to do, because it's led to much better workouts with my different teams, is I would call for 3 exercises and I would let them pick 2 or 3. So we would always do our squats, we would do glute ham raises and something else, right? For instance, the squat, glute ham raises, and I wanted their upper back to be strong, so needed them to do face pulls. Okay? And then I would let them pick the other 2 or 3 exercises for that day with some constraints. I always had veto power. And sometimes I would even have one exercise that I've never seen before, and they had to come up with it. And that was just for fun, right? But that autonomy for them being able to pick those exercises, that made them buy in more. And that made the workouts go better. with the VBT. If the faster and harder they push, the more that they can improve. And their relatedness. And God, if you're not using relatedness right now, coaches, slap yourselves in the face. They need to understand what the transfer is between what they're doing and the athletic skill. I am horrible about relatedness. If I don't think there's a relationship, I'm not doing it. I'm not wasting my time. And I think that many athletes are the same. If they don't see or understand the transfer, they're not going all out. When you get those three things together, and VBT is a great way to do that, dude, the magic happens. And I think that that's a big reason why VBT has been so helpful and so impactful for so many coaches. Don't know where that came from. So a lot of times people try and throw the zones in with the Olympic weightlifting movements. Man, don't do it. There's different ranges of motion. Whenever you get down to it, and you know what, Tim Sukumel and I are working on a lot of this right now. So I would highly see this, getting a lot more derivatives on there and going. For the hang power snatch, going from the hang, catching in the power position, the mean velocity was about 1.96. The hang power clean is 1.32. I've gone to, I give a lot of peaks on that, but a lot of people still like mean velocity, so I left it here. We'll get to peaks here momentarily. Clean pulls, whenever I was trying to do it super heavy and overload the movement, I was moving at 1.15, a snatch pull at 1.45. Now, whenever we're trying to enhance power, it's the exact same. And why do you think that is? Well, if you look at the research from Harbili et al., it says that the peak velocity should occur at the top of the second pull. Yeah. Well, what is a clean pull and a snatch pull? You're hitting the second pull. So it would be exactly the same as the lift movement, which we'll get to here momentarily. Some side notes on the Olympic lifts. I've kind of, I just showed you the mean velocity, and that's what I used forever. And the reason why I used it forever is because the Tendo, that's all it used to do. It was giving you average and metric and English standard units. But one of the things that I noticed over time was that athletes who were banged up, the bar would look like it was moving really fast and give them a slow reading for velocity. So the orthopedic issues typically alter the form. So they would have a fast pull and a slow catch, and that means, the mean is the mean velocity, average velocity is the mean of the start to the finish of the movement. So those alterations in form led to a decreased velocity. So typically we had the high peak and the low average. Again, like I mentioned, it was a form discrepancy because they couldn't catch. It hurt. Since we know that the peak velocity occurs at that defined moment, I started going to peak velocity for the most part. Now, while the mean velocity, there was a more gradual relationship and you could go beyond it a little bit. For the peak velocity, man, it's like a cliff. You hit the edge of that cliff and it just falls off and they're not able to get it. The velocities that I have listed out here are going to be the 1RM terminal velocities as by height, as we'll get to here in a moment. I don't know what happened there. The cleans from the floor, the height, right? In the U.S., height in meters, and then the velocities for 1RM. So and I'm going to be honest with you guys that from the hang, it didn't matter, right? So we did a study with, I would say that reasonable form might be a bit of a stretch. Somebody said good form, it wasn't good, or reasonable might be a stretch. But their terminal velocity, regardless of height on the hang clean, was 1.44 meters per second. But whenever you're doing excellent form, you got people that are dialed in. These tend to be about right for their 1RM velocities. Here it is for the jerk. The lifter's height, man, let's talk about this. The squats and other movements within the rack. The 1RM terminal velocity did not change significantly, right, from Zordos in 2016. Actually, it was Helm, so I apologize for that. Mike Zordos was the anchor on that. What they ended up doing was they did the squats, right, and they found that the 1RM velocity didn't change between them. And the heights, there were some, they were all over the place. Here's the deal. from my experience, what do taller people do with their feet? Put them out wider. So they have an alteration to the frontal plane, which limits sagittal plane movement. Okay? So they add to the frontal, take away from the sagittal. So you'll see this a lot of times that, and I'll be honest with you, my zones, I think for athletes 6'6" and below, Division I athletes, they're easy. But once you hit about 6'8", the wheels fall off, and you got to basically bump the zones up 0.1, 0.15. Now, why is that? Well, the rack only goes so wide, dude. So at some point in time, you're gonna have to, you can't go any wider, so you're gonna have to get a greater range of motion. For Olympic lifts, stance during the pulling phase may impact peak velocity. That was necessary to hit there, and also the width of the stance on catch will affect the velocity because of how far you had to go down. And that's the 1AA football example I gave. Something I adapted from Sukumail Comfort is that a lot of people like the tier system, right? And here's just some of the different weightlifting derivatives and what they're best for. For effort, for being able to do just lift heavy ass weights, mid thigh pull, going from the blocks where it's set up and you're only moving it a couple inches, a counter movement shrug, starting in the ready position, dip down and pop up as hard as you can, or clean pull, snatch pull from the knee or from the floor for the clean. And then we see the speed and we see the volume. I won't bore you guys with going over this, and honestly, I think Tim Sukumail's got some stuff through the NSCA that I think would be very, very beneficial for you to watch if this is your bag. We've talked about this already. Theoretically, adding in higher velocity movements may have improved power and continued the trend. So I think I mentioned before that we only did strength speed. If we would have done speed strength, that very well might have listed a higher adaptation. Then what about the change of stimulus? What if we would have gone from cleans to snatches? Or if we would have gone from, let's say, full squat to half squat? I don't know, man. I think that it might have elicited some better adaptations, but I'm never going to be able to know, right? That's 15 years of data that we were looking at. Was the adaptation to the change of stimulus? It doesn't matter. If you have a change of stimulus, then you're set. Future research will examine the force signatures to see what effect VBT and other training has. So we're looking at basically the transfer index. VBT does have a limit in transfer. At some point, special exercises may become necessary. Looking at things like the quarter and the half squat, lunges performed in specific manners, with the horizontal resistance. The quarter and the half squat, why am I talking about that? We'll think about joint angle specificity in the study from Matt Ray about squat depth and transfer to sprints and jumps with trained athletes. That the full squat did have a transfer. Of course it did, but it just wasn't as high as the half and quarter squat. Other exercises, the knee drive and the paw back, if you're looking at the work from Michael Yessis or Brian Heiderscheit. Shock method, it's not just depth jumps. You can do it another way. Special hip exercises, special throwing exercises. Dude, VBT has a limit. We're going to have to look at special exercises at some point. So with some of my current thoughts, regardless of the system that you use or how you use it, we know that weight moved is for that exact set, right? Because of that load-velocity relationship, as we'll show again here in a minute. With the VBT, it takes into account all stressors, and that's how it makes that weight being able to be moved for that exact set. We can look at it from in another way that it goes back to that linear relationship is the load-velocity profile. That I used to call the velocity profile, and that's not entirely correct because, you could have a load velocity, you could have a force velocity. It's what in velocity profile. The feedback is for that day, for that set, for that moment. You're getting that instantaneous feedback that is going to help further drive results. Because whenever you get down to it, dude, that's what it's all about. It's cut me the check, show me the check score. That we want to make sure that it's done appropriately. The linear relationship between velocity and the percentage of 1RM. right? I'm sorry, the optimal weight for that day and set. And then we're going to also look at some of the stuff with stress's cumulative effect because, hey, guys, it's not just about the stress of training, man. We've got a whole life worth of stress to mess with. Now, let's look specifically at this Jadovsev, Harris, Kryerlin, and Cronin. They put together this really super nice paper where they looked together and they looked at all of the at the relationship between percentage of 1RM and velocity for their population that they did. And we could see that, hey, you know what? If I want to know what what velocity to train at, I go negative 0.0146 times the percent of the 1RM that I'm wanting to train at. I add 1.7035, and that's going to give me the average velocity. And that was based off of a bunch of people. So that we see that, what is this here? What am I looking at? Well, on the vertical axis, I'm seeing the average velocity. And on the horizontal axis, I'm looking at the relative load, the percentage of 1RM, right? For this group on this bench press, and this is one of the higher ones. I'm 97% sure that this was bench press on a Smith machine. They found it 0.23 plus or minus 0.09 meters per second. So what can we say about this population? It's probably they're a little bit on the lesser trained side, or it could be that because it was a Smith machine. I'm not completely sure, but I've seen a lot of work with the bench press by a subsequent study that'll come out that we'll look at here in a minute, that's showing 0.15, which is more about what I see with college athletes. 0.23, that might just be their training status. But an interesting thing that we also see is that, if you're wanting to know what would be the optimal load for a isometric, well, that load zero, theoretical load zero that they talked about in this paper, a tremendous amount, it's 116 plus or minus 8%. So anywhere from 108 to 125%, 124% would be considered the ISO. So if I'm a coach, what do I do? Well, what if, I throw in that 116%, and for some people it's too light and they need to get up to 125% or 124%, excuse me, I keep saying that, or maybe 108%, so that this is that range, guys, that there's no one. And we even look at this. This is a super wide variation, 0.09. Well, some guys were down at 0.14, some guys were up at 0.32. And some of this, I think, comes from the fact that it's hard to say a 1RM, especially if you haven't been involved. One of the things that I've noticed with myself, with coaching some of my athletes, is that sometimes they just think that it feels heavy, and they need somebody to tell them, no, dude, it ain't heavy. Dan Baker and I have exchanged stories before over some beverages that it's like, hey man, this guy was hitting, well, for instance, I'll just tell the story about a soccer player of mine who thought that we were doing a load velocity profile and just kind of checking to make sure that they were within the zones, and they were. The upperclassmen were, the younger classmen were not, but they're untrained, so this is to be expected. They have no neuromuscular efficiency. This lady decided at 0.5, she's like, okay, I'm done. That's my last set. And I'm like, no, man, you're not. She's like, well, but that was super heavy. I don't think I can get any more. I'm like, well, look, this is 0.5 meters per second. This is about 80%. I would bet that you would be, I pulled out the calculator, handed it to her, and I'm like, I think this is what you're going to be able to do your 1RM. And she was right on the nose. I think it was something like 217, and she 1RM 215. So sometimes the utilization of velocity for me helps with some of the coaching decisions of teaching the athlete, like, hey, you know what, that felt heavy, but that really isn't heavy. You just don't know what you're capable of yet. And sometimes that helps them to unlock that. Now, that being said, what if you've got some untrained athletes, and not untrained, but lesser trained, maybe they've been training for a year or two. Their technique starts to break down. Well, what if they're and usually in some data that I've dealt with, at about 80% of 1RM is where you tend to have breakdowns occur. Technically, well, this kind of allows us to project out and see what their 1RM is. We've all seen these times where these athletes went up, oh my gosh, the average for the freshman class, their squat increase was 130 pounds. Well, dude, was it that much, or was it really like 15 or 20 because they just weren't capable of illustrating to you what their maximum was? So, there's a lot of different things that fall into this. This is the raw data from the 3 different studies, and we look at the R on all of these, and they're really, really tight. 0.96, 0.95, and 0.95 on the cross-referencing. So we see that, hey, man, this actual load to the actual load, actual 1RM versus the load 0, and the prediction and stuff, it's nice, man. This relationship's nice. Now, with those 1RM predictions, like I just mentioned, you can use the 1RM values and the individual slopes. So what do I mean by individual slope? Is like, hey, look, what is this dude's... we're going to have some people that don't fit into the mean. And honestly, with the 1RM prediction, I think it's far more accurate to look at the individual's regression equation. And GymAware happens to do that for you. There are probably other devices too. I just don't know them. I go with one and I stop. But whenever we look at that individual slope, and that allows us to get the greatest prediction of 1RM. One of the things that we've always got to take into account is research is based off of a mean value, right? And I may have mentioned this before in here. I don't know. I feel like I've been talking forever. But long story short, Andy Galpin was talking about a study that he did where the mean was, let's say, I don't remember what it was. Let's say it was 20, but not a single person got scored a 20. That was just the mean. So we've got to take that into account that, hey, this is based off of the average, and then it gives you a range to have an idea. If you want the greatest precision, of course you're going to use an individual. Now, I don't like going, so for the 1RM predictions, I think that the individual is fantastic, especially if you've got a spreadsheet you can just throw some stuff into, or if you've got GymAware, it'll auto-populate and throw it on out there. So then having that 1RM, using the individual, I think it's perfect. The cutoffs that I've been using, what I typically see is somewhere between 0.12 and 0.18 on bench, 0.25 to 0.35 on squat, and 0.22 to 0.32 on deads. So here is just this is for my own personal workout, and this is the last workout before my daughter was born, my first daughter, right? And I was typically around about a 430 max, and we see that, hey, it says 396. It might have been 425 typically on average. Well, if we look down here, we can see that this 345 set was off. Why was it off? Why was it so low? Let's just say my training partner's laundry day, he didn't have any underwear, and he stayed over top of me. He didn't step back from the bar while bench pressing. And I was looking at something I didn't particularly care to see, and I yelled at him to get that thing out of my face. And then completed the lift, because we can go up and see that the 365 set was faster than 345. So that's what happened there, and that's what pulled my average down. Then we look at the first workout back after that. Now, I had continued to train. For those of you who have kids, you know that if you don't have some sort of outlet, you're going to explode, right? At least for me. So I trained the whole time, but I didn't throw velocity on because I just felt weak because of the amounts of stress that I was undergoing. Well, what do we see here? I come in, I'm actually roughly about the same body weight, but I'm at a 335 max now. So roughly about 90 pounds down in, about 2 months, right? What had happened? Dude, life, stress. So I had these individual stresses that changed my performance. Muscle mass wasn't different, weight wasn't different. There wasn't a whole lot different other than stress, and that caused a massive swing in my 1RM. Now, there's a study in French by Miller in 1997 that said the various stressors impacting the autonomic nervous system. That there was, everything affects the nervous system. It all does. Everything that you do, from any noises that come by, meditation you do, things that you eat and drink, all of it impacts the autonomic nervous system. Training is no different. And again, there's no appreciable change in muscle mass. Now, let's look at this next table from the Gonzalez, Badillo, Sanchez, Medina paper, right? This is a pretty classic paper, at least from my standpoint. We look here on the left. I think they trained for like 8 to 10 weeks, and the 1RM changed 9.3 plus or minus 6.7% for any of these given percentages. The velocity there, though, stayed the same. Okay, this is trial 1, so pre-test. T2 is post-test, and this is the T1 to T2 difference between the velocities that they had achieved. And whenever you get down to it, you look here, and this is all super tight, 0.000 or 0.01. We see that there are 2 that are marked with an asterisk. This shows that if you just simply look at it, well, that's 0.02 clearly, but it says 0.01. Whenever you went out to the full number of digits that they had calculated, it came down to 0.01, and it just popped out to 0.02 with rounding. And the same thing occurred here where it's 0.00, but we see a difference there. Okay. Now, here is the raw data for that study, and they use mean propulsive velocity. Okay, now mean propulsive velocity, in case we haven't talked about it or you haven't heard about it before, it's just of the propulsive phase. So with lighter loads, you have to decelerate for sometimes even longer than what you're in acceleration for. So this is a way to account for that, right? And honestly, it doesn't do a whole lot of difference, right? Let's look here that we see, let's just look, instead of just the equation, let's look at the R-squareds, okay, 0.98. Standard error, estimate of there, standard error of 0.06 meters per second, and then the n, whatever. Let's not even worry about the n. But if we look, r squared 0.979, standard estimate of the error is 3.77. So percent. They didn't give the velocity on this. Why? Don't know. Maybe it was 0.037. That I might have made a mistake with the production of the slide, which shows that, hey man, it was a little bit better on the standard error, and not much, a minuscule amount. That would be splitting hairs. And the R squared, this says 0.98, the other says 0.979. Man, I don't know, dude. It sounds like the same to me. But some claim that mean propulsive is better. Maybe it is. Maybe it's not. To be quite frank, all I've got is mean velocity, peak velocity. I'm going to go with the stuff that I've got and the stuff that I know and the stuff I've used for 20 years, rather than the full cell change for one thing. Volitional velocity on a free weight exercise. Okay, this was bench press, right? Just get rid of. Don't even pay attention to these that are greater than 1. Okay, why? Because that's 100%. These are failed attempts. What? Somebody tried 125%? Yeah, they were an idiot. This is from Division II athletes. And if you'll notice, about 60%, it just does that funneling effect to get larger. Otherwise, I think it's a curvilinear rather than straight linear relationship with the free weight exercises. But that's yet to be determined. And you know what? I need to go back and actually write this up, right, to get it as a study. We see the same thing here, right? So we see that there's definitely a relationship, linear, curvilinear, whatever it happens to be, okay? And it's volitional. Did we tell them to go as fast as they can? No, I didn't. Was that intentional? No, man. It was that I forgot to tell my people that I was working with to do that. Whenever I noticed that, oh, hey, these other 4 people aren't telling them to go faster, I better stop. And so after about 5 people, and we just rolled with it because they had never actually even been instructed. So this wasn't even my athletes. These are Division II from a local university. And since the athletes trained with the volitional velocity and never maximal intent, they never tried to go as fast as possible in the squat and the bench press, I thought that it would throw off the testing results. And we can still see that even without maximum intent, without being told to go super fast, that there's still a pretty tight relationship. So I think that's pretty cool. Now, some athletes do not exhibit linear relationships, but they're going to go, this is something that Dan and I have talked about a couple of times, that he'll see a straight line from 50 to 60, 60 to 70, etc. So 50, 55, 60 would be straight, but then there might be some little ups and downs, but they always fall around a regression type. Now, I've found 2 types of athletes who do not fall around the line. And honestly, it's they don't understand strain, or they are extremely weak, and you have the same problem, is that you are really shifted. Okay, so you are, what they have as listed as 100% 1RM, okay, that might be 0.5, 0.6 meters per second. Well, that's really 80%. So if I shifted it back here, then they would fall within that line. So really, it is an expression rather than what they are doing. So really, we've got to take into account technical failure here, right? Did they actually achieve momentary muscular failure, or was it technical failure? And is there a big gap between the two? Okay. Now, what do I mean by that? Looking at velocity, it's going to be obvious. It's like 0.6 meters per second, but his technique broke down. Great, cool, cut it. There's no reason in getting hurt. But realize that's not their 1RM. That's not their actual capability. That's all they could show you that day. But that, if we're talking in terms of force, load, dude, nah, man, go ahead. They need to be training light, and they need to, whatever, to improve their technique. They ought to probably be doing some exercise to strengthen up the weak link. But here's the deal, man. It's not that they don't have the relationship. It's that the understanding, the expression of which is thrown off. So if you would just simply look at the velocity and the actual load and then track that over time, I think that you would see the 1RM come around after a while. Now, the accounting for outside stressors, man, like we were just saying, everything affects the autonomic nervous system. It can be, if the ANS is depressed or excited, the motor recruitment is going to follow that. The rate coding is going to follow that. It's controlled by the autonomic nervous system. It can't do anything else, man. There's no magic fairy dust in here. So you go with it. Now, here's something from Jovanovic. It says that, actually, it was just Jovanovic and Flanagan. That's a typo on my part. But we can see that, hey, this dotted line across is the pre-cycle test at 1RM. And the solid line is the 1RM. Right? So we could see that for this individual, some days they were up at above 30 kilos from their pre-tested 1RM. Some days they're 21, 22 kilos down. That's a pretty big swing. I mean, 52 kilos, 26 either way. That's kilos, dude. That's not even pounds. It's kilos. So 26 kilos, 52, 57 pounds either way. That's a huge swing, right? So here's the deal with the velocity and looking at the relationship between percentage of 1RM. It allows you to be right on every given day. I've been to Vegas a lot of times for conferences, guys. I'm not a lucky individual. I'd rather be right than lucky. Now, we look also with the stress and the 1RM relationship, right? Here is the actual, a lot of people have read that effects of academic stress on illness and injuries in Division I football that we put out a few years ago. I can't remember what year it was now. But this is the histogram that set it all off, and then that's another talk in itself. But here we see that, hey, during training camp they had higher injuries during high academic stress. It was fewer, but not as many as training camp, and low academic stress. Here we are. So it looks like, oh, this is exactly what I would expect. You're hitting a lot, you're not hitting as much, but you have a little bit more stress, and there's no stress. Okay, that makes sense, right? But let's look here. This is B. Okay, I want you to look at B down here. Now, what is this? Well, this is everything. A is the whole team. B, we broke up to only the subjects that played. And C is the subjects that didn't play. Now, some people are going to notice immediately 46 plus 51 is 97. What happened to the 4 people? Kickers and punters. One, they're kickers and punters, so they're just weird, right? That's a joke. But now they didn't technically meet the requirements that we set for played, and that was a number of snaps over the course of the season. I don't remember what that was. But then they were starting at their position, so we couldn't say that they didn't play either. So it was a conundrum, and we just eliminated them. Okay? So here's what we look here. HPS is high physical stress, that's training camp. HAS, it is a test week, project week, whatever. LAS is low academic stress, that's a normal week. So training camp to a test week, we see that the odds ratio 1.13, there is no significant difference between the two. Great, okay, 0.75. So there's no difference between, for those that played, training camp and test week. So this essentially pops up to here, or this comes down, one of the two. Let's just say it moves up, right, for only the people that played. High physical stress to low academic stress is 2.84, right? And it is significant. So training camp to regular week. Yeah, no kidding. You hit a lot more during training camp, you're going to get hurt more. High academic stress, test week versus low academic stress, 3.19. Again, the significance, it's statistically significant. Don't throw, if something's significant, don't start, some people used to battle in the p-values. Well, this is better because blah, blah, blah. No, significant. But with this odds ratio, we see that there is a higher likelihood of somebody playing getting hurt during a test week than a low academic, or than training camp. That melted my face off, man. Stress is stress is stress. Doesn't matter what the source. Doesn't matter if it's a 300-pound dude. Doesn't matter if you have to sit in my classroom and take a test from me. Stress is stress is stress. All stresses act the same way, but to different intensities, like with the activation of that HPA axis, etc. So let's look at a little bit of integration, right? VBT, it's simply replacing percentages if you want to throw it into an annual plan. So instead of saying I am doing training at 60% today, just swap it out to whatever happens to be. Let's say it's 0.8 for 60%. That's pretty common for my athletes on a squat. So, like the traditional phases during the off season, let's look at this and apply it here. Anatomical adaptation. Well, since we have large range of motion, low intensity, slow movements, the velocity and percentage of 1RM, let's be honest, they're irrelevant. I'm looking at quality of movement. I'm not looking for power. And in fact, if I try and do a mobility exercise for speed, I lose the reason for doing the exercise. It's like it's like urinating into a fan. It doesn't make any sense. You're just getting it right back, blowing right back onto you. That's stupid. Hypertrophy and endurance phase. That's typical. That sometimes people call it lactate tolerance. Well, velocity is really irrelevant because it's all about time under tension. Okay, so you might be doing forced eccentrics and things like that. Now, there's always a caveat to everything. What if I'm just caring about selective hypertrophy? Then, of course, I'm going to want to use a velocity loss cutoff. What about strength? That's where I start looking at it, maybe from 0.5 meters per second on down, and looking at it for cutoffs to prevent failure. And then the same thing in the strength power phase with the strength. And the power, I'm going to break it down to strength speed or speed strength, and I'm going to live just in that zone. Okay. Now, here's just an example of just simply, it's like, okay, here's the velocity, here's my corresponding percentage of 1RM, and all I'm doing is swapping it out. Now you see velocity 1, velocity 2. This is whenever we're looking for the strength power stuff, right, down in here. So that's it, man. I had the same sets and reps, the same percentages, essentially. I just did it to velocity so I can account for the outside stressors. So that's something that's pretty cool, that especially if you use an individual load-velocity relationship. Velocity loss is something that's pretty big now. It is just stopping when you drop below a certain cutoff. And it could be a set percent. That's what currently is the biggest in the literature. I don't have any scientific reasoning behind this, but I used to use, whenever I didn't want to induce a lot of fatigue, just a 0.05 meters per second. Whenever they dropped more than 0.05 in the set, we cut it off. That leads to a higher quality of work and selective hypertrophy. What do I mean by selective hypertrophy? That we're targeting the type 2 fibers. There's several studies that examine this, but one that I think is pretty cool that isn't looking at this in a short-term period. It's looking over the course of by proxy over the course of an individual's career. They looked at Werner Gunther and Werner Gunther's twin brother, and they did the biopsies of both of those, and they did it on Werner again after he was finished, like I think it was 2 or 3 years after he was done competing and done training. And they found that his training, so naturally, see if I included that slide, I did not. So naturally, he was really about 33% fast twitch. Or 37% fast twitch fiber, type 2 fiber. Well, his cross-sectional area was actually somewhere around 70%, 67%, 68%, something like that, for his cross-sectional area of fast twitch fiber. So he didn't have a lot, but what he did through his training was expand his, fully just blow up his type 2 fibers as much as possible. Now, here are some changes in performance. Trying to remember, this is the 40% to 20% study by Pareja Blanco. Let's just look here. 40% velocity loss had a 14 kilo increase. This one had a 19 kilo increase. We see that, hey, there was, for both of them, they were significantly better. There was no significant effect, even though there was more for the 20, but the difference wasn't significant. You got to throw in the standard errors, which, if you'll notice, are pretty small for the velocity loss 20. It gets bigger for 40, and it stays the same for the 20. Just interesting. I'm looking at the standard deviations. The velocity, average velocity, is going to be higher in the 20 group. All the velocities will. Let's look down at the counter movement jump. We see that, hey, Both of them are significant. Oh, no. The counter movement jump for the 40 is not significant, nearly significant, but not significant with its 1.5 centimeter increase versus the 3.7 that is significant here. And of course, whenever we're looking between the two groups, we see that yes, for the counter movement jump, it was significantly better. And then we come down here, and this is one of the little befuddling ones that, I need to reach out to Fernando and see if he's looked at it this way. We see that there was a slight increase, right, a 0.03 increase for the 20-yard sprint. And we see that there's a 0.01 decrease. Now, there's something called a minimally and clinically important difference or smallest worthwhile change, right? Smallest worthwhile difference. This very well might be insignificant, but it might be better than it would be at the smallest worthwhile difference for that 20. It's 0.01 or 0.02, I think. But that was for a different population. That was for college football players. But sometimes you get into that. But you see that there's no significant difference between the two, pre and post. So then there's no significant interaction on the time. But if we look to the cross-sectional area, this is really blowing that up. So if we look at the 40%, basically everything increases in size, and then the type 1 actually increases in the percentage. We look here, let's just look at the type 1 fiber percentage for a second on the velocity loss 20. And quite frankly, I don't think I really ever go up to a 20% velocity loss. I'm more of a 10% guy. We see that even at a 20% loss, we see a transition away from the type 1 fibers. So we see a decrease of about 2%. It's non-significant. Right? It is not significant, but we see that it's there. And we see that the 2C fibers, which is the intermediary between 1 and 2, has an increase. So it's looking like, hey, kind of interesting here that almost we're seeing a pretty good shift. That's all I'm going to say. I'm not going to go into any more speculation there. The 2As did increase. The 2Xs showed a decrease, probably shifting over to 2A, and the 2X showed a small decrease, so that we're seeing a shift from the 1 to the 2. And quite frankly, if we went with a longer time period, I think that we would have seen a significant change. But here's what we're seeing is that the fibers are blowing up more for the type 2s and the type 1s with a smaller velocity loss, so that not as much fatigue is induced. So then the type 1 fiber isn't getting the same amount of work, so then it doesn't respond with hypertrophy. Okay. What can VBT do for you? It can replace some of the percentage-based training. It can prevent neuromuscular fatigue. So instead of somebody, hey, you just do 3 sets of 8. Well, we can make sure that we don't induce too much fatigue for what they've got that day with the velocity loss. The percentage-based training we saw previously with the example of the periodization and the prevention over training. We're getting close to being able to predict 1RM off of volitional or max intended velocity. A lot of the work that's out there currently is done on Smith machines. I don't think that that's a good idea. I have collected a lot of data with athletes that I need to get around to writing up. I'm teaching 21 credit hours this semester, so it ain't going to be soon. There's a very tight relationship between the percentage of 1RM and the velocity, which is how it can take the place of some of the percentage-based training and why we're getting so close to being able to predict each individual lift. The test-retest difference was 0.01 for that 8-week or 12-week program that we saw from Gonzalez Badillo and Sanchez Medina. Again, hypertrophy work is irrelevant. So, again, prevention of overtraining. We know that velocity is neural. Here's one of the things that as a coach that I think that is extremely important for younger coaches to realize is that either 1RM or velocity, it's either there or it's not. Intermediary, you can grind. You can do intestinal fortitude. Honestly, you know what? Even more so, even 1RM to some extent, right? Sometimes people will simply will a weight up and they won't stop until they get it, drop the bar, almost pass out. We've all seen that before. But with velocity, it's either there or it's not. You cannot grind it. So that velocity loss is huge, right? And the load velocity relationship. Understand when velocity is greatly decreased, a deload may be in order. These people are just tanked. So go ahead and give them give them not necessarily a day off, but change up training. It might be a good day for bodybuilding. Stimulate the high levels of lactate, which stimulates the anabolic hormones. It might help them to recover. But what if you don't use those exercises? That's cool, man. Why don't they? Well, maybe they don't transfer to your sport. Great, pick something else. And also remember, general means don't always transfer beyond those initial levels. You squat for a while, but you may need to look elsewhere. Maybe it's crew. I think they've moved away from it now, but bench row used to be like their big predictor exercise. I think we have seen since then that, hey, it's actually lower body strength, not even the lat strength that matters so much because they're pushing with their legs, so, whatever. So whenever you get down to it, what do? How do you find out what to use? Well, great. Perfect the technique in that exercise, measure the velocity with perfect technique, and make a load velocity profile. When you find that the power begins to decrease, stop. You don't have to go to 1RM. Why? Well, dude, most of the time, these special exercises, they're not meant to be done heavy anyways. They're done for the velocity of the spectrum. So we see that whenever power goes down, we know that the force has gone up to a high extent, and power is what we care about anyways. We make it move up and make it move sooner. Typically, if the line, most of the lines that I've seen on the exercises, they're all about the same slope, right? So what I've been doing is just adding 0.25 on for strength speed and dropping, adding 0.25 on for speed strength and then taking 0.25 off for strength speed from peak power. Okay, so guys, that's it for this little tutorial. Hopefully you found it useful. Hopefully you got something out of it, and hit me up with questions or whatever. I'm always available to come out and do in-services and things to, whatever I can do to help you with your program, man. That's what it's all about. People helping people. Let's make sure that we're not just recreating the wheel. If in the next 20 years, I'll probably, I'm 41 now. I probably won't retire until I'm 70 or 80. If by the end of that, we're still talking about just zones, we've done each other a disservice. All right. Hope all's well. And thanks, guys. Let me know if you need anything in the comments below, or you can email me at bmann, just bman at miami.edu. My Twitter handle, is at jbryan, Bryan, man. So you can get at me however you need to. Thanks.